Looks like we're live on Facebook.
Excellent.
Welcome. Welcome. My name is Amy Stark. I'm the communications coordinator for the Indiana Council on World Affairs. Joining me is Dr. Fiona Hill and Abdul Hakim Shabazz, and also Ray Montagno. On January 19th at 7 p.m. Eastern, the ICWA kicks off their Distinguished Speaker Series by welcoming Dr. Fiona Hill to share a program entitled Ukraine 1 Year Later. Dr. Hill has graciously accepted to do a 15-minute live Zoom preview, and I could think of no one better to ask to be the interviewer than Abdul Hakim Shabazz, who is a broadcaster and an influencer throughout the state of Indiana. And so now I'm going to turn over the Zoom to a professional, Mr. Shabazz.
All right, thank you, Amy. I always be happy to help out the World Council. Dr. Hill, thank you very much for joining us today. We really do appreciate it. Let's start by just asking, 1 year later, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how would you assess how things have gone so far for both the Ukrainians and the Russians and the world for that matter?
Well, look, this has been a massive catastrophe, and I don't think anybody needs me to tell them that. I mean, we're all feeling it. I mean, including in Indiana and obviously, here in Washington, D.C. This is one of those conflicts that changes the world, whether we like it or not. And in fact, I mean, it's on such a scale that, of course, all kinds of comparisons are already being made with World War I and World War II. We've had the nuclear saber rattling by Vladimir Putin that's put us back to those terrible memories that, some of us will have of the Cuban Missile Crisis back in the 1960s, and also the war scares of the 1980s during the Euro missile crisis, which was, mostly in Europe, but also was affecting the United States. It's the largest refugee crisis since World War II. And of course, the scale of deaths on both sides of the conflict of Ukraine and Russia are really kind of beggaring the mind. If we've really got 100,000 casualties in Russia, that is, that's on top of the military casualties in Ukraine, of course, which has been invaded. But that far outweighs the number of casualties that the Soviet Union had during its conflict in Afghanistan, which was one of the precipitating factors for the collapse of the Soviet Union, back in the late 1970s, 1980s. There was about 14,000 people were killed, soldiers in the Soviet armed forces, which also included Ukraine and other former Soviet republics then, and 100,000 casualties here for Russia in this conflict, on top of all of the civilians killed. And of course, we're speaking now on Martin Luther King Day against the backdrop of this horrific bombing of the town of Dnipro in Ukraine, where several apartment blocks have been taken out. We're seeing war crimes evidently being committed, civilian infrastructure and populations being targeted. And all of this was supposed to start in Vladimir Putin's mind as a special military operation, something limited back on February 24th, 2022. So this has been a catastrophe of colossal proportions.
It's interesting too, because you said Mr. Putin said it's going to be like a military operation. Obviously, 1 year later, just like there's any end inside. Do you think the Russians maybe sort of underestimated how the Ukrainians and how the world would react?
Yeah, and I mean also overestimated their own ability to pull this off. So there's a lot of underestimation and overestimation going on at the same time. The underestimation of Ukraine comes in multiple ways. On the one part, they didn't think that the Ukrainians would fight back to the extent that they have. They underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian military, thinking it would fold. They also perhaps overestimated their influence on Ukrainian politics. Basically, Putin thought that he'd bought all Ukrainian politicians, including Vladimir Zelensky, through various corruption, networks of oligarchs, business people who were basically in these industrial sectors that Ukraine was dominated really by Russian influence. There was also the penetration of the Ukrainian intelligence services by the Russian intelligence services. They thought they had it all sewn up. And they basically thought that somebody like Zelensky, who'd been an actor, who'd been heavily involved in activities in Russia, was Russian speaking, Jewish, that he wasn't really a Ukrainian patriot. They figured that his resolve wasn't even there, and that basically Ukraine would fall apart at the first application of extreme pressure. And then, the Russians completely underestimated how the rest of the world would react. And frankly, I think we all underestimated ourselves too, right? I mean, if you were asking the average American, the average Brit, the average European, German, French, you name it, about how they would react to this, what they would do on February 23rd, they would never have anticipated the extent to which Europe has rallied behind this, and also the way that Ukraine has captured the imagination of Americans. When Russians would ask me and other colleagues before this, what does Ukraine mean to you? It was always hard pressed for people to say beyond Ukrainian Americans and, populations out in the Midwest, for example, or, our support for Ukraine's independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity. The idea that people would be putting themselves on the line for Ukraine seemed far-fetched. And so, of course, all of that has come into play.
We're talking today to Dr. Fiona Hill. She'll be giving a presentation on Thursday, the 19th, for the Indiana World Affairs Council. So we're having a preview that conversation right here, right now. Dr. Hill, how would you sort of score Prime Minister Zelensky's performance and all this? 'Cause like you said, he was an actor. We looked like there was a lot of underestimation on both sides, but how would you describe his performance over this past year?
Well, look, I mean, if we were, he was in a performance, we'd be giving him, multiple, basically standing ovations, wouldn't we? We were kind of thinking of him as a performer because he has really exceeded all expectations, probably even his own. And I think the fact that he is a performer has come into play here. He has stepped into the role of wartime leader with an incredible adeptness and shown real courage and resilience. And everybody is, basically pointing out, making these comparisons, Winston Churchill, that he's channeling his inner Winston Churchill. Not every wartime leader does rise to the occasion in that way, and he's been able to do it. And he's obviously found deep reserves of resilience within himself, not just his ability to perform and to play a role. And he's really channeling now the whole spirit of Ukraine itself. He's put Ukraine on center stage globally through this performance. Now, if we'd looked at that beforehand, and again, going back to how Putin and the people in the Kremlin miscalculated, he wasn't very popular in Ukraine on the eve of the war. His popularity had fallen, and he'd been a kind of a compromise candidate in the elections outside the box, trying to, basically it was more of a sign of Ukrainians were so fed up with everybody else who'd gone before when he was elected. Not that people were sort of seeing him as somebody who was going to be so essential in this kind of environment, because nobody was anticipating that. He'd been embroiled in political infighting. The Ukrainian economy was in something of a crisis. He wasn't seen as being, perhaps the most adept leader on the eve of the conflict. And now he's proven, really that he was the kind of person that they absolutely needed for this kind of crisis.
And on the flip side of that, how would you sort of rate Vladimir Putin? Because once again, you talk about sort of an overestimation. If anyone gets the overestimator award of 2022, it's got to be Vladimir Putin.
Well, that's very absolutely true. I think Putin has been in power for so long, 22 years, 23 years now, we've gone into 2023, that he's started to think of himself as infallible. He's the symbol of the state. He can't do any wrong. Every time something goes wrong, he pulls a rabbit out of a hat and, something basically changes. And that's, part of the problem that we have now. Putin refuses to even admit to himself, perhaps he can't even do that so many things have gone wrong. He actually sees that he can still do this. He can still achieve the goals that he had of getting Ukraine to capitulate, taking Ukraine off the map, annexing Ukrainian territory, and forcing back all of the support that Ukraine has got from Europe, the West, the United States. So Putin still believes that he can adapt to the situation and he can take victory out of the jaws of defeat. And of course, we're watching how he does that. It's by being absolutely brutal and ruthless. Basically, Vladimir Putin still thinks that he can bomb Ukraine into submission, and that by raising the spectre of more carnage, the use of nuclear weapons and the battlefield, for example, they can get the rest of us to pull back. And of course, the war's had all kinds of global impacts. It's imperiled food security around the world. In Africa and the Middle East, for example, places that were very much dependent on Ukrainian grain as well as Russian grain, and the experiences blockade of the Black Sea that Putin has imposed. Also, energy security, pulling the plug literally on oil and gas for Europe. Putin's kind of assumed that everybody else would be weak, would show weakness. And he still thinks that he can push everybody's buttons, that he can turn the rest of the world against Ukraine by using the United States as a foil there. This is all about the United States. And for all the countries out there that feel aggrieved about things the United States has done, he's been framing this as an existential battle, not with Ukraine, but with the United States and the West and NATO. And a lot of people have bought into that because Putin just simply thinks that he can talk his way out of this, bomb his way out of this, use disinformation and propaganda, and that, we will all pull back. So right now, he doesn't think that he has basically been the greatest underestimator or the greatest overestimator. He still thinks that he's got this.
Our guest on the program today is Dr. Fiona Hill. She's speaking on Thursday with the Indiana Council on World Affairs about the situation in the Ukraine. She's with the Brookings Institute. So, Dr. Hill, like I said, we appreciate you being with us. Let's look forward. How much longer do you see this conflict going?
Well, look, that's really hard to say. I mean, I hate to say it. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, and anybody who's giving you concrete predictions, they're really kind of basing this more on rule of thumb judgments than they are on any kind of hard data that we can really use to predict where this is heading. I mean, there are certain trends that we can see here. And when we could see that this could go on for a heck of a long time because both sides are really dug in. And if we think about some of these World War I analogies that have come up, you can see trench warfare, particularly in the region of the Donbass, that's been contested now since 2014. You've got to remember that it's already been going on a long time. Russia annexed the peninsula of Crimea in Ukraine in 2014 and started off a war in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. And so, we're getting close to a decade of that right now. And so if we put that in that context, we've probably still got quite a ways to go because we've got trenches, we've got both the sides dug in. We remember World War I went on for a very long time in trench warfare. The battle is not just on the front line or behind the front lines in all this horrible bombardment of civilian infrastructure, but it's also a political battle. And the Russians are waging this in the United Nations. They're waging this with other countries, further afield, that they want to help them avoid sanctions and to, keep on their support, their political support. It's in the propaganda and information space. So really, it's up to us to how this ends and how long this lasts. I mean, when I mean us, I don't mean just the United States, but the United States working with its allies, not just our NATO allies, European allies, but Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and all the other countries in the world who would actually like to see this stop. And that actually includes not just India. And, many of the people listening to this may have noted that the Indian government's been quite outspoken on wanting to see this war end. And they're in a very difficult situation, kind of stuck between Russia, China, the United States, Pakistan, and difficult neighborhood that they're in there. And they would just like this to stop and to go away because it's really creating a lot of problems for them and for other regional countries, but also China. This is not something that China wanted to see. And if we can work with countries that, we may have a difficult relationship with, like China, on trying to constrain the ability of Putin to keep waging this war, we can help to bring it to a conclusion, far faster than it might otherwise be. But it requires a very serious diplomatic effort, not just what we're doing so far, which is giving Ukraine a lot of military equipment to fight the war and training to use this equipment. It requires a full-on diplomatic effort as well, and all the things that we're also doing to put pressure on Russia to constrain their abilities to conduct the war on the economic and financial side.
Final question for you, Dr. Hill, and thank you very much for your time today. We really do appreciate.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Abdul. Thank you so much.
You and your time. We talk about a diplomatic solution. What is it? Because obviously, it's not like the Russians want $100 million, Ukraine wants to give them 50, so we split the difference at 75 or something like that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. What is the diplomatic solution? Is it giving back land? Is it a ceasefire? Is it Ukraine agreeing not to join NATO? What does that diplomatic solution look like?
Well, look, it's going to be quite complex. And, there are many different things that could be on the table here, as you've suggested. But one of those is actually trying to get a cessation of hostilities. So we're far away from the kinds of negotiation process that we would like to see here. And I want to also make it clear that we're not likely to find some ideal solution, because as you said, it's not that easy. And you've already laid out there that this isn't just a kind of a bargaining. And any solution is going to resolve, or any process that might lead towards a resolution, is going to involve some major compromises on the part of Russia. Because pretty much what Putin is saying, well, yeah, we could end the world war tomorrow. I will stop all of this if Ukraine acknowledges the fact that I've taken all their territory, or all this territory, and recognizes it's being part of Russia. Well, that is not acceptable for everyone else either, because that sets a precedent that for the kinds of activities that we saw happening in the world in the 20th century and in previous centuries before. We said after World War II, no way. We are never going to allow basically the invasion of countries, annexation of territory, and changes of borders by force. And, you know, we've tried to stick to that throughout the whole of the Cold War as well. And Putin's basically saying, well, no, sorry, I'm showing that might is right, and that Russia still has its imperial rights to retake territory, and we just can't let that happen. So we're going to have to find mechanisms for not acknowledging Russia's seizure of territory. I mean, the irony of all of this is when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, that prior to its invasion of the whole of Ukraine, after this, there was actually discussions going on of finding a process that would, over a longer period of time, perhaps moving towards some kind of recognition of Russia's not sovereignty, but let's just say, de facto rule of Crimea. We were working on the kinds of processes that people keep talking about now. But it's very hard to see something like that at this juncture, after this brutality, this carnage, and every violation of every international norm we can think of. So we're going to have to be creative here. So this is a time for creative solutions, as well as, you know, really kind of thinking about this in all of its different dimensions. There's no easy answer to this conflict. And what we're seeing, of course, is the United States, Europe. It's not just the United States on its own that people seem to think of, but the rest of the world, and in fact also watching very carefully what's happening here, watching very closely, a real desire to have Ukraine regain as much territory as it can, you know, basically before we move on to, you know, some process. But there has to be a cessation of hostilities, and not just on Vladimir Putin's terms. He still wants the capitulation of Ukraine, and we have to push back against this, because it doesn't bode well for everyone else, including ourselves, after this, if he gets away with it.
Dr. Fiona Hill, speaking Thursday at the Indiana Council on World Affairs. Dr. Hill, thank you very much for being with us. Always appreciate you and your hard work, and all you folks at the Brookings Institute. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me today. Thank you.
And thanks, Abdul, and thanks to all who tuned in. I hope you're able to join us on January 19th at 7 p.m. as we invite Dr. Hill to present Ukraine 1 year later. And I hope all of you have a great day. And if you need any more information, go to indianaworld.org. Thanks.
All right.